Hey guys, tonight we're talking about cocaine, the only drug in history that went from being prescribed to children for toothaches to fueling global cartels that make billion-dollar corporations look like lemonade stands. In the 1880s, the most respected doctors in Europe called it a miracle cure for everything from depression to shyness. By the 1980s, it was destroying entire cities and filling American prisons faster than any disease ever could. The same substance that Sigmund Freud praised in medical journals became the reason Pablo Escobar could afford his own private army. Here's the twisted part. Cocaine is still legal medicine today, sitting in hospital cabinets while people serve life sentences for possessing the exact same chemical compound. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand cocaine, you first need to understand how spectacularly wrong the medical establishment can be when they're convinced they've discovered something revolutionary. The year was 1859, and a German chemist named Albert Niemann isolated a crystalline alkaloid from Peruvian coca leaves. He called it cocaine. The substance had been used by indigenous Andean peoples for thousands of years, but they chewed the leaves for mild stimulation during high-altitude labor. Niemann had created something far more concentrated and far more dangerous. He died 2 years later at age 26, possibly from his own experiments, but his discovery was already spreading through European laboratories like a virus through a crowded room. By 1863, a Corsican chemist named Angelo Mariani created Vin Mariani, wine infused with cocaine extract. The drink contained about 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce, which doesn't sound like much until you realize people were drinking multiple glasses daily. Mariani marketed it as a medicinal tonic that could restore health, strength, and vitality. Pope Leo III gave it an official endorsement and appeared on advertising posters. Queen Victoria drank it. Thomas Edison praised it. President William McKinley kept bottles in the White House. Mariani received a gold medal from the Pope and made a fortune selling what was essentially a cocaine delivery system disguised as sophisticated European refreshment. The American pharmaceutical industry saw an opportunity. Park Davis and Company, one of the most reputable drug manufacturers in the United States, began producing pure cocaine for medical use in 1885. They weren't subtle about their enthusiasm. The company's advertisements claimed cocaine could supply the place of food, make the coward brave, the silent eloquent, and render the sufferer insensitive to pain. They sold it in multiple forms: powders, cigarettes, tablets, and injectable solutions. A Park Davis catalogue from 1885 offered a complete cocaine kit containing a syringe and enough cocaine for recreational use, marketed to doctors as essential medical supplies. The price was reasonable, the product was legal, and respectable physicians prescribed it for ailments ranging from hay fever to nymphomania. Then came the most famous endorsement in cocaine's early history. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis and one of the most influential intellectuals of his era, became cocaine's passionate advocate in 1884. Freud wasn't some fringe charlatan. He was a serious medical researcher working at Vienna General Hospital, trying to establish himself in the competitive world of European medicine. He obtained cocaine samples and began experimenting on himself, keeping detailed notes on the effects. The drug made him feel confident, energetic, and mentally sharp. He experienced euphoria without apparent negative consequences. Within months, he published Über Coca, a medical paper praising cocaine as a wonder drug with applications for treating depression, digestive disorders, and morphine addiction. Freud's recommendation of cocaine for morphine addiction deserves special attention for its spectacular stupidity. Morphine addiction was a massive problem in the 1880s, created partly by doctors who had overprescribed morphine during the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. Thousands of veterans returned home addicted to the drug. Freud genuinely believed cocaine could cure this addiction because it produced energy and well-being without morphine's sedative effects. He prescribed cocaine to his close friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, who suffered from chronic pain and morphine dependency. The results were catastrophic. Fleischl-Marxow became severely addicted to cocaine, consuming enormous doses and suffering from cocaine-induced psychosis with terrifying hallucinations. He died in 1891, destroyed by the very treatment Freud had recommended. Freud quietly stopped writing about cocaine's benefits, but the damage was done. His early papers had given the drug scientific legitimacy. Medical journals across Europe and America published enthusiastic studies about cocaine throughout the 1880s. The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical publications, featured articles describing cocaine's harmless properties and therapeutic potential. Doctors reported success treating everything from seasickness to sexual dysfunction. No one conducted long-term studies. No one tracked what happened to patients after months or years of regular use. The scientific method, supposedly rigorous and evidence-based, failed completely because researchers were too excited about their new miracle drug to consider its dangers. They saw immediate benefits and assumed those benefits would continue indefinitely without consequences. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies raced to incorporate cocaine into consumer products. Coca-Cola launched in 1886 with a formula containing cocaine extract from coca leaves and caffeine from cola nuts, hence the name. Inventor John Pemberton marketed it as a patent medicine that could cure morphine addiction, dyspepsia, neurasthenia, and headaches. The drink contained approximately 9 milligrams of cocaine per glass in its original formulation. Americans drank it for refreshment without realizing they were consuming a powerful stimulant. Coca-Cola wasn't alone. Dozens of cocaine-containing tonics, elixirs, and soft drinks flooded the market. Burnett's Cocoane promised to cure colds and sore throats. Rhino's hay fever and catarrh remedy delivered cocaine directly into nasal passages. Anglo-American Drug Company sold cocaine toothache drops specifically marketed to children, with advertisements showing happy kids finally free from dental pain. The over-the-counter availability of cocaine in the 1890s seems insane by modern standards, but it reflected the era's general attitude toward drugs. Pharmacies operated like candy stores for psychoactive substances. Heroin was sold as cough medicine. Morphine was available without prescription. Cocaine fit perfectly into this landscape of unregulated pharmaceutical chaos. A housewife could walk into any drugstore and purchase cocaine powder or lozenges as casually as buying aspirin today. No questions asked, no records kept, no warnings given. Doctors handed out prescriptions freely, and many became addicted themselves. Cocaine use among physicians reached epidemic levels by the late 1890s because they had constant access and genuinely believed the drug was safe. The first cracks in cocaine's reputation appeared around 1890, but the medical establishment ignored them. Emergency rooms in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia began admitting patients with bizarre symptoms: rapid heart rates, dangerously elevated body temperatures, severe paranoia, and violent hallucinations. These patients had one thing in common: they were regular cocaine users. Some had been taking it as prescribed medicine. Others had discovered they could purchase it easily and use it for pleasure. The line between medical use and recreational abuse dissolved quickly because cocaine's effects made people want more regardless of why they'd started taking it. Doctors noticed patients returning for refills far more frequently than medical necessity would suggest, but most attributed this to the underlying condition rather than the treatment itself. Hospital records from the 1890s tell a darker story than contemporary medical journals admitted. Massachusetts General Hospital documented cases of cocaine-induced heart attacks in patients under 30 years old with no previous cardiac problems. Bellevue Hospital in New York treated multiple cases of what they called cocaine psychosis, patients who became convinced invisible enemies were attacking them, who tore at their own skin believing insects were crawling underneath, who became violent toward family members and medical staff. One physician at the New York Neurological Society described treating a patient who'd been using cocaine regularly for 2 years as prescribed for depression. The patient eventually suffered complete mental collapse, requiring permanent institutionalization. These cases were published in medical journals, but they were treated as rare exceptions rather than warnings of systematic problems. Factory owners had discovered cocaine's potential for increasing worker productivity. Textile mills, steel foundries, and railroad companies experimented with providing cocaine to laborers during long shifts. The drug allowed workers to go longer without rest, suppress hunger, and maintain focus during repetitive tasks. For a brief period, some industrial operations openly distributed cocaine as a workplace benefit, the way modern offices provide coffee. The results seemed miraculous initially. Production increased, workers complained less about exhaustion, and profits rose. Then workers started collapsing on factory floors. Heart attacks struck men in their 20s. Accidents increased because cocaine-fueled confidence made workers take dangerous risks. The productivity gains evaporated as addiction took hold, and workers became unable to function without the drug. Cocaine's effects on the brain created a cruel trap that users and doctors failed to understand until it was too late. The drug produced intense euphoria and energy by flooding the brain with dopamine, but this artificial stimulation came at a cost. Regular users found that normal activities no longer brought pleasure. Food tasted bland, conversation felt boring, sex became unsatisfying. Only cocaine could make them feel alive. They needed increasing doses to achieve the same effects as their brains adapted to the chemical onslaught. What started as occasional medical use for headaches became daily consumption, then hourly consumption, then a desperate cycle of using cocaine to function and crashing into depression when it wore off. Many users discovered this progression only after they were trapped in it. The American South saw particularly disturbing developments in cocaine use during the 1890s. The drug became associated with African American laborers, partly because white employers sometimes provided it to black workers as a form of payment or to increase productivity during harvest seasons. Racist propaganda soon followed, with newspapers publishing hysterical articles claiming cocaine made black men superhuman and violent. The cocaine-crazed Negro myth became a tool for justifying increased police violence and discriminatory laws. These false narratives had real consequences. Several Southern police departments switched from .32 caliber to .38 caliber pistols specifically because of fabricated reports that cocaine made black men impervious to smaller bullets. The racism was transparent and horrifying, but it shaped American drug policy for decades. Cocaine became racialized in public perception, transforming from a respectable medicine used by white doctors and European intellectuals into a supposed threat from black communities. By 1900, the death toll from cocaine was undeniable, even as pharmaceutical companies continued marketing it aggressively. Coroners in major American cities reported dozens of cocaine-related deaths annually, with the actual number likely far higher since cause of death determinations were primitive and many overdoses were attributed to heart failure without identifying the underlying drug use. The New York Times published articles about the cocaine habit destroying young people's lives. Medical societies began holding conferences specifically about the cocaine problem, yet cocaine remained completely legal and easily available. The disconnect between growing evidence of harm and continued widespread sale reflected the enormous profits involved and the reluctance of the medical profession to admit its catastrophic mistake. Some doctors began prescribing treatments for cocaine addiction that were almost as dangerous as the drug itself. The most common approach involved using other drugs to manage withdrawal symptoms, morphine to reduce anxiety, alcohol to help with sleep, chloral hydrate for sedation. Essentially, doctors treated cocaine addiction by creating new addictions to different substances. Specialized addiction sanitariums opened, charging wealthy patients enormous fees for treatments that rarely worked. These facilities promised miracle cures through various methods: cold baths, electrical stimulation, hypnosis, religious conversion. Almost none of their patients achieved lasting recovery because the fundamental brain changes caused by chronic cocaine use weren't understood, and the treatment philosophy focused on willpower rather than neuroscience. The pharmaceutical industry's response to mounting evidence of cocaine's dangers was to downplay the risks and blame users rather than the substance. Parke-Davis continued advertising cocaine products while adding disclaimers that problems only occurred in people who abused the drug rather than following medical guidance, a distinction that meant nothing given cocaine's inherently addictive properties. Merck, the German pharmaceutical giant that had become one of the world's largest cocaine producers, insisted their product was safe when used appropriately. These companies had made fortunes from cocaine and weren't about to stop voluntarily. They lobbied against proposed regulations, funded research designed to show cocaine's safety, and positioned themselves as defenders of medical freedom against government overreach. Understanding what cocaine actually does to the human brain reveals why doctors and users alike missed the catastrophe brewing beneath the surface of their miracle cure. The drug operates through a mechanism so elegant and so devastating that it essentially hijacks the most fundamental systems controlling human motivation and pleasure. Every mammalian brain contains a reward circuit designed to reinforce behaviors essential for survival: eating, reproducing, social bonding. This circuit uses dopamine as its primary chemical messenger, releasing small amounts when activities benefit the organism. Cocaine doesn't just activate this system, it detonates it. Normal dopamine function works like a carefully regulated conversation between neurons. A neuron releases dopamine into the synapse, the gap between brain cells. The dopamine binds to receptors on the receiving neuron, transmitting its message. Then transporter proteins quickly recapture the dopamine and return it to the original neuron for reuse or breakdown. This entire cycle takes milliseconds, maintaining precise control over how much stimulation occurs. The brain evolved this tight regulation over millions of years because excessive dopamine signaling causes serious problems. Cocaine destroys this delicate balance with brutal efficiency. When cocaine enters the bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier, it immediately blocks dopamine transporter proteins. Imagine trying to evacuate a nightclub, but someone has locked all the emergency exits. Dopamine floods the synapse with nowhere to go, continuing to stimulate receptors far longer and more intensely than nature intended. Dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's primary reward center, can increase by 300% or more during cocaine use. This massive surge creates the euphoria users experience, but it also begins a cascade of adaptations that guarantee eventual disaster. The subjective experience of cocaine intoxication feels like becoming a superior version of yourself. Energy courses through the body. Mental clarity sharpens to laser focus. Confidence soars to heights most people never naturally experience. Social anxiety evaporates. Physical fatigue disappears. Sexual desire intensifies dramatically. Time seems to slow down while thoughts race at incredible speed. Everything feels significant, interesting, achievable. This isn't subtle like caffeine's gentle lift. Cocaine makes users feel genuinely superhuman for 30 to 60 minutes. That sensation is the trap disguised as a gift. The physical effects extend far beyond the brain's reward circuitry. Cocaine acts as a powerful sympathetic nervous system stimulant, triggering the body's fight-or-flight response. Heart rate accelerates, sometimes to dangerous levels above 150 beats per minute. Blood vessels constrict throughout the body, sharply increasing blood pressure. This combination forces the heart to pump harder against greater resistance, demanding more oxygen while simultaneously reducing blood flow to cardiac tissue. Young, healthy users have suffered heart attacks during their first cocaine experience because the cardiovascular stress can exceed the heart's capacity, regardless of baseline fitness. The drug doesn't care about age or health status. Body temperature rises during cocaine intoxication, sometimes reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The brain's hypothalamus loses its ability to regulate temperature normally. Blood vessel constriction reduces the body's capacity to dissipate heat through the skin. Increased muscle activity from cocaine-induced agitation generates additional heat. Users in this hypothermic state have literally cooked their internal organs, suffering permanent brain damage or death from heat stroke. Emergency room physicians in the 1890s documented cases of cocaine users arriving with temperatures high enough to cause delirium, seizures, and organ failure. Symptoms they initially couldn't explain because the connection between cocaine and hypothermia wasn't yet understood. The pupils dilate dramatically under cocaine's influence, becoming so enlarged that users' eyes appear almost entirely black. This occurs because cocaine blocks reuptake of norepinephrine as well as dopamine, overstimulating the muscles that control pupil size. Light becomes intensely bright and uncomfortable. Reading becomes difficult. The effect is so pronounced that physicians in the 1890s actually used cocaine specifically as a diagnostic tool during eye examinations, applying it topically to dilate pupils before looking inside the eye. They somehow failed to connect this powerful physical effect with the drug's potential for harm when taken systemically. Appetite vanishes completely during cocaine intoxication. The drug's effect on hypothalamic circuits suppresses hunger signals so effectively that users can go days without eating and feel no discomfort. Weight loss was actually promoted as a benefit in some early cocaine advertisements targeting women. What the advertisements didn't mention was that this appetite suppression contributed to overall physical deterioration. Users running on cocaine without proper nutrition began showing symptoms of starvation, muscle wasting, weakness, compromised immune function, and organ damage. Some of the cocaine casualties in early medical reports died not from direct drug toxicity, but from malnutrition after weeks of barely eating while maintaining their habit. The euphoria phase ends abruptly, usually within an hour. Users describe the transition as falling off a cliff into dysphoria. The massive dopamine surge during intoxication depletes the brain's dopamine stores. Dopamine-producing neurons can't synthesize the neurotransmitter fast enough to replenish what's been exhausted. The result is a crash characterized by profound depression, fatigue, anxiety, and anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure from anything. Food tastes like cardboard. Music sounds flat and uninteresting. Social interaction feels exhausting. The contrast between cocaine-induced euphoria and the post-cocaine crash creates an obvious solution in users' minds. Take more cocaine. This cycle accelerates with terrifying speed. The brain adapts to repeated cocaine exposure by reducing dopamine receptor density and sensitivity. Neurons essentially protect themselves from overstimulation by becoming less responsive to dopamine signals. This neuroadaptation means users need progressively larger doses to achieve the same effects. the classic definition of tolerance. What started as a single line of cocaine becomes 2 lines, then 4, then 8. Users in the late 1890s progressed from occasional use to consuming gram quantities daily within months. Their brains had been fundamentally rewired to require cocaine for normal functioning. Chronic cocaine use causes structural changes visible on modern brain imaging that weren't detectable with 1890s medical technology, but were nevertheless occurring. Grey matter volume decreases in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, impulse control, and decision-making. White matter integrity deteriorates, disrupting communication between brain regions. The hippocampus shrinks, impairing memory formation. These changes explain why long-term cocaine users exhibit impaired cognition, poor decision-making, and inability to control their use despite devastating consequences. The drug literally damages the brain structures required for rational behavior and self-control. Cocaine-induced psychosis emerges after prolonged use or high-dose binges, usually appearing 3 to 12 months into regular consumption. Users develop paranoid delusions, believing they're being followed, monitored, or targeted for harm. Visual and tactile hallucinations are common. Many users experience formication, the sensation of insects crawling under the skin. Some users tear at their flesh trying to remove the imaginary parasites, creating severe wounds. Auditory hallucinations also occur, with users hearing voices, footsteps, or whispered threats that aren't there. This psychotic state can persist for weeks after cocaine use stops, and in some cases becomes permanent. Psychiatric hospitals in the early 1900s housed dozens of former cocaine users who never recovered their sanity. The cardiovascular damage from chronic cocaine use proved uniquely deadly in ways doctors didn't recognize until they'd seen enough autopsies. Cocaine causes premature and accelerated atherosclerosis, hardening and narrowing of the arteries. Even young users in their 20s developed arterial disease normally seen in elderly patients. The drug promotes blood clot formation, while simultaneously causing blood vessels to spasm unpredictably. This combination created a perfect storm for heart attacks and strokes. Cardiologists examining cocaine users' hearts found scarring indicating multiple small heart attacks that had occurred without the user even realizing it. The heart muscle was being destroyed incrementally with each use. Nasal septum perforation became a telltale sign of chronic cocaine snorting by the early 1900s. The drug's vasoconstrictive properties reduce blood flow to the delicate nasal tissues. Without adequate blood supply, the cartilage separating the nostrils begins to die and decay. Users noticed frequent nosebleeds, crusting, and difficulty breathing through the nose. Eventually, the septum developed holes that grew larger with continued use. Some users' nasal septums completely disintegrated, collapsing the nose structure and causing severe facial deformity. Reconstructive surgery was primitive at the time, leaving many chronic users permanently disfigured, a visible marker of their addiction that society would mock rather than recognize as a medical consequence. The lung suffered damage even though most 1890s cocaine use involved oral consumption or nasal insufflation. Cocaine-contaminated blood circulating through pulmonary vessels caused inflammation and scarring. Some users developed a chronic cough and difficulty breathing. Autopsies revealed extensive fibrosis and hemorrhaging in lung tissue. These findings confused physicians who expected respiratory damage only from inhaled substances. The systemic nature of cocaine's toxicity meant no organ was safe. The drug reached every tissue through the bloodstream and caused damage wherever it went. Liver damage occurred in chronic users as the organs struggled to metabolize the constant influx of cocaine and its toxic breakdown products. Enzymes that normally process drugs became overwhelmed. Liver cells showed signs of stress and began dying. Some long-term users developed hepatitis and cirrhosis without any alcohol consumption. Their livers simply couldn't handle the chemical burden of processing gram quantities of cocaine daily. Jaundice appeared, yellowing of skin and eyes, indicating severe liver dysfunction. By this point, the damage was often irreversible. Kidney failure emerged as another complication that doctors initially didn't attribute to cocaine. The drug causes intense vasoconstriction in renal arteries, reducing blood flow to the kidneys. This ischemia damages the delicate filtering structures. Additionally, cocaine increases muscle breakdown, releasing myoglobin into the bloodstream. This protein clogs kidney filters and directly damages renal tubules. Users experiencing rhabdomyolysis, the medical term for this muscle breakdown, had dark, cola-coloured urine and severe pain. Some required dialysis. Others died when their kidneys shut down completely. The neurological impact extended beyond addiction and psychosis. Chronic cocaine users suffered strokes at dramatically elevated rates compared to age-matched non-users. The combination of increased blood pressure, vasospasm, and enhanced clotting made cerebral blood vessels vulnerable to rupture or blockage. Young people in their 20s and 30s experienced strokes that left them paralyzed, unable to speak, or cognitively impaired. Neurologists examining these patients found extensive brain damage that seemed impossible in someone so young. The strokes weren't always massive and obvious. Many users accumulated small strokes over time, gradually losing cognitive function in a process that mimicked dementia. Seizures plagued chronic cocaine users, occurring both during intoxication and withdrawal. The drug lowers the seizure threshold by disrupting normal electrical activity in the brain. Users with no history of epilepsy suddenly experience convulsions. Some seizures resulted in serious injuries from falls or prolonged oxygen deprivation. Status epilepticus, continuous seizures lasting more than 5 minutes, proved particularly deadly because no effective treatments existed in the 1890s. Medical staff could only watch helplessly as patients seized repeatedly until their brains suffered irreversible damage or they died from exhaustion. Sexual dysfunction appeared paradoxically despite cocaine's reputation as an aphrodisiac. Initial use increased libido and stamina, leading to cocaine's popularity among prostitutes and their clients in the 1890s. However, chronic use led to erectile dysfunction in men and anorgasmia in both sexes. The physiological mechanisms involved both vascular problems from cocaine-induced vasoconstriction and neurological changes affecting sexual response pathways. Many male users eventually became impotent despite intense desire. This complication was rarely discussed in medical literature of the era due to Victorian prudishness, but it contributed significantly to users' psychological distress. The immune system weakened under chronic cocaine exposure. Users experienced frequent infections, slow wound healing, and vulnerability to diseases they would normally fight off easily. The mechanisms involved both direct effects of cocaine on immune cells and indirect effects from poor nutrition, inadequate sleep, and elevated stress hormones. Tuberculosis ravaged cocaine-using populations in the early 1900s because their compromised immune systems couldn't contain the bacterial infection. Pneumonia killed users who would have survived if their bodies hadn't been weakened by months or years of cocaine abuse. Withdrawal from cocaine, while not immediately life-threatening like alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, created a psychological hell that drove relapse rates above 90%. Users experienced crushing depression that made suicide seem like a reasonable solution. Anhedonia so complete that nothing, food, sex, music, friendship, provided any satisfaction. Intense fatigue that made getting out of bed feel impossible. Powerful cravings that dominated every thought. Sleep disturbances with vivid nightmares. This constellation of symptoms could last weeks or months, far longer than most users anticipated. the promise of instant relief through another dose of cocaine became almost irresistible. The cruelest aspect of cocaine's mechanism is that it exploits the very systems designed to keep humans alive and motivated. Evolution created dopamine signaling to reward behaviors beneficial for survival and reproduction. Cocaine provides the reward without the behavior, teaching the brain that nothing matters except obtaining more cocaine. Every natural pleasure, food, sex, accomplishment, social connection, becomes secondary to the drug. Users don't choose to prioritize cocaine over their families, careers, and health because of moral failure. Their brains have been chemically reprogrammed to value cocaine above everything else. Understanding this mechanism makes the tragedy of cocaine addiction even more disturbing, because it reveals just how vulnerable human neurobiology is to a simple alkaloid molecule that happens to fit perfectly into our dopamine transporters. The first documented cocaine epidemic erupted in American cities between 1895 and 1905, catching the medical establishment completely unprepared despite a decade of warning signs they'd systematically ignored. Hospital emergency departments in New York recorded a 400% increase in cocaine-related admissions between 1895 and 1900. Bellevue Hospital alone treated over 200 cases of acute cocaine poisoning in 1899, compared to fewer than 20 in 1893. Chicago's Cook County Hospital reported similar patterns. Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Hospital established a dedicated ward specifically for cocaine cases because regular psychiatric facilities couldn't handle the volume. These weren't isolated incidents scattered across the country. This was a coordinated collapse happening simultaneously in every major urban center. The profile of cocaine casualties evolved rapidly and disturbingly. Early cases involved middle-class white patients who'd begun using cocaine as prescribed medicine and couldn't stop. By 1900, the demographics had shifted dramatically. Factory workers represented the largest group of emergency admissions, having discovered cocaine could help them endure 12-hour shifts in brutal conditions. Prostitutes came next, using the drug to maintain energy for multiple clients per night and to numb themselves emotionally to the work. Criminals formed the third major category, relying on cocaine for courage during robberies and to stay alert during long nights of illegal activity. The drug had migrated from respectable pharmacy counters to society's margins in less than a decade. Young people proved particularly vulnerable to cocaine's appeal and particularly susceptible to rapid addiction. University students discovered they could study longer and more intensely with cocaine's help. Athletes used it for competitive advantage. Artists and writers convinced themselves the drug enhanced creativity. A disturbing number of medical students became addicted, having easy access to pharmaceutical supplies and believing their professional knowledge would protect them from harm. It didn't. Harvard Medical School quietly expelled several students for cocaine addiction between 1898 and 1902. Columbia University dealt with similar problems. Yale University's secret records, not revealed until decades later, showed that approximately 8% of students in the class of 1900 had serious cocaine problems. The workplace cocaine crisis reached catastrophic proportions in specific industries. Railroads faced an epidemic among engineers, conductors, and brakemen who used the drug to stay alert during long shifts. Several major train accidents between 1898 and 1905 were attributed to cocaine-intoxicated personnel making critical errors. The worst occurred in September 1903 when a freight train engineer high on cocaine missed signals and collided head-on with a passenger train outside Cleveland, killing 21 people. The subsequent investigation revealed that cocaine use among railroad workers was so widespread that supervisors were afraid to implement drug testing for fear of losing half their workforce. maritime industries struggled with similar problems. Steamship companies discovered their engine room crews were using cocaine to tolerate the extreme heat and long watches. The drug's popularity among sailors created a distribution network that spread cocaine to ports worldwide. Ships arriving in New York, Boston, and San Francisco regularly carried cargo that included illegal cocaine shipments hidden among legitimate freight. Dock workers used the drug to handle the physical demands of loading and unloading vessels. The entire maritime supply chain became saturated with cocaine, creating smuggling routes that would later prove essential to organized crime's drug trafficking operations. Medical professionals began suffering addiction at rates that threatened the entire healthcare system's credibility. Doctors had the easiest access to pharmaceutical cocaine and initially believed their medical training immunized them against addiction. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. By 1902, an estimated 15% to 20% of practicing physicians in major American cities struggled with cocaine dependency. Surgeons performed operations while intoxicated. General practitioners prescribed cocaine to patients while hiding their own addiction. Pharmacists dipped into their inventory for personal use. The American Medical Association received complaints about cocaine-addicted physicians but had no standardized response. Disciplinary actions varied wildly between states, and many addicted doctors simply moved to new jurisdictions when caught. Cocaine deaths multiplied faster than public health systems could track them. Coroners in 1905 attributed approximately 400 deaths to cocaine in New York City alone, but this figure represented only cases where cocaine was definitively identified as the cause. Many deaths were recorded as heart failure, stroke, or suicide without investigation into whether cocaine was involved. The true death toll was certainly thousands higher. Medical examiners lacked standardized toxicology testing. Many bodies weren't examined at all. Families could claim deceased relatives without autopsy if they paid burial fees quickly. Cocaine-related deaths disappeared into the statistical noise of general urban mortality. The psychiatric consequences of widespread cocaine use overwhelmed America's limited mental health infrastructure. Asylums designed to house a few hundred patients found themselves managing thousands of cocaine-induced psychosis cases. Patients became violent, requiring physical restraint for weeks or months. Some never recovered their sanity despite complete cessation of drug use. Manhattan State Hospital on Ward's Island admitted 89 patients with cocaine psychosis in 1904, compared to just 12 in 1894. These patients exhibited symptoms, paranoid delusions, violent outbursts, self-mutilation, that asylum staff had never encountered in such volume. Treatment options were essentially non-existent beyond physical confinement and sedation with other dangerous drugs. Crime rates in cocaine-saturated neighborhoods exploded between 1900 and 1910. Users stole to fund their habits, committed robberies while experiencing cocaine-induced fearlessness, and became violent during paranoid episodes. Police departments didn't track cocaine-related crimes separately from general crime statistics, but contemporary newspaper accounts make the connection clear. The New York Times published dozens of articles about cocaine fiends committing burglaries, assaults, and murders. Many of these stories were sensationalized or outright fabricated, but they reflected a genuine underlying problem. Cocaine addiction was driving property crime and violent crime to unprecedented levels. The drug's association with prostitution created a feedback loop of addiction and exploitation. Pimps supplied prostitutes with cocaine to keep them working longer hours and to create chemical dependency that prevented them from leaving. Women who became addicted sometimes entered prostitution specifically to fund their cocaine habits. Reformers trying to rescue women from sex work discovered that cocaine addiction was often a bigger obstacle than the prostitution itself. Women who wanted to leave couldn't tolerate withdrawal symptoms and returned to the life that gave them access to drugs. Vice districts in cities like New Orleans, Chicago, and San Francisco became open-air cocaine markets where the drug was sold as casually as alcohol in legal saloons. Southern states weaponized cocaine panic to justify racial oppression with pseudoscientific claims that particularly targeted African Americans. Newspapers published articles claiming cocaine made black men impervious to pain, superhumanly strong, and prone to sexual violence against white women. None of this was true. Cocaine's effects don't vary by race, but the propaganda served its purpose. Several Southern police departments officially justified switching to larger caliber weapons by citing the supposed threat of cocaine-crazed Negroes who couldn't be stopped by standard ammunition. This racist mythology persisted for decades and directly influenced the development of discriminatory drug laws. The 1914 Harrison Narcotics Tax Act attempted to control cocaine distribution through taxation and registration requirements rather than outright prohibition. The law required anyone manufacturing, distributing, or dispensing cocaine to register with the federal government and pay occupational taxes. Physicians could still prescribe cocaine, but they had to keep detailed records. The legislation passed with minimal opposition because even pharmaceutical companies recognized the growing political pressure to address the cocaine crisis. However, the law contained enormous loopholes and weak enforcement mechanisms. Doctors could prescribe cocaine for any condition they deemed appropriate. No limits existed on prescription quantities or refill frequencies. The registration requirement was easily circumvented. Implementation of the Harrison Act demonstrated how thoroughly cocaine had penetrated American society. Over 200,000 physicians, pharmacists, and other healthcare providers registered under the new law in its first year. This represented virtually the entire medical profession. Cocaine prescribing wasn't confined to a few bad actors, but was standard practice across the country. Treasury agents assigned to enforce the law found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of legitimate cocaine commerce they were supposed to monitor. Compliance checking was essentially impossible, given the limited number of federal agents and the massive number of registered practitioners. The law's biggest failure was its inability to address existing addiction. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were already dependent on cocaine by 1914, and the Harrison Act offered them no path to recovery. Treatment facilities barely existed. Most physicians didn't know how to help addicted patients even if they wanted to. The law simply criminalized addiction without providing medical alternatives. Addicted individuals who'd been obtaining cocaine through legitimate pharmacy channels suddenly faced a choice: suffer through agonizing withdrawal or turn to illegal sources. Most chose the latter, instantly creating enormous demand for black market cocaine. Criminal organizations recognized the opportunity before law enforcement did. The same networks that had been distributing illegal alcohol during local prohibition experiments quickly expanded into cocaine trafficking. Italian organized crime families in New York, Irish gangs in Boston, and various criminal syndicates in other cities established cocaine supply chains within months of the Harrison Act's passage. These groups bribed pharmacists to divert pharmaceutical cocaine, smuggled cocaine from European manufacturers, and eventually established relationships with South American cocaine producers. The profit margins were extraordinary. Cocaine that cost $10 per ounce at wholesale could be cut with adulterants and sold at street level for $200 or more per ounce. World War I temporarily disrupted cocaine trafficking by interrupting transatlantic shipping routes, but this proved to be only a brief respite. Germany had been the world's largest cocaine manufacturer through companies like Merck and Boehringer. When the war cut off German supplies, manufacturers in France, Switzerland, and the Netherlands expanded production to fill the void. After the war ended in 1918, global cocaine production resumed at even higher levels. European pharmaceutical companies had discovered a massive American market that would purchase cocaine regardless of legal status, and they were happy to supply it through whatever channels necessary. The 1920s began with cocaine use declining slightly from its peak, but still maintaining epidemic levels in urban areas. Then Prohibition changed everything. The 18th Amendment banning alcohol created a sophisticated national criminal infrastructure for distributing illegal intoxicants. Bootleggers who smuggled whiskey also carried cocaine. Speakeasies that served illegal alcohol sold cocaine openly. The same criminal organizations, distribution networks, and corrupt police officers who made alcohol prohibition such a spectacular failure also ensured that cocaine remained readily available. Prohibition didn't stop Americans from drinking. It just moved alcohol sales from legitimate businesses to criminals. The same dynamic applied to cocaine. Jazz Age culture embraced cocaine enthusiastically despite its illegality. Musicians discovered the drug-enhanced stamina during long performance sets. Dancers used it to keep moving through all-night parties. The Harlem Renaissance saw significant cocaine use among artists and intellectuals who viewed the drug as part of bohemian lifestyle. Nightclubs in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles operated openly as drug distribution points, with the knowledge and often the cooperation of the local police who were paid to look the other way. Cocaine became glamorous, associated with wealth, sophistication, and cultural rebellion against Prohibition's moral strictures. Hollywood's film industry developed a serious cocaine problem during the silent film era. Actors used the drug to maintain energy during grueling production schedules that sometimes required 16-hour workdays. Directors and producers used it to stay alert during long shoots. Studio executives used it recreationally at parties that became legendary for their debauchery. Several prominent actors died from cocaine-related causes in the 1920s, though studios suppressed these deaths or attributed them to other causes to avoid scandal. The industry's cocaine use was an open secret among insiders but carefully hidden from the public. Law enforcement efforts against cocaine proved both ineffective and corrupt. Federal narcotics agents made periodic arrests of low-level dealers, while largely ignoring major traffickers who had sufficient political connections or bribery funds. Local police departments in major cities were thoroughly compromised. Officers accepted regular payments from drug dealers in exchange for warnings about raids and protection from arrest. Some police officers dealt drugs themselves, using their positions to eliminate competition and avoid prosecution. The few honest law enforcement officials who tried to seriously combat cocaine trafficking found themselves transferred to undesirable assignments or driven out of their departments. Treatment options for cocaine addiction remained primitive and largely ineffective throughout the 1920s. Asylums offered little beyond forcible confinement during acute psychosis. Private sanitariums charged enormous fees for treatments that rarely worked. Cold water therapy, electroshock, surgical interventions. Some physicians still prescribed other drugs like morphine or heroin to manage cocaine withdrawal, simply substituting one addiction for another. The concept of evidence-based addiction treatment didn't exist. Most interventions were based on moral theories about willpower or pseudoscientific ideas about balancing bodily humours. Success rates remained abysmal. Public health responses to the cocaine epidemic failed because society fundamentally misunderstood addiction as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. Newspapers portrayed cocaine users as weak-willed degenerates. Preachers condemned them as sinners. Politicians used them as scapegoats for urban crime. This moral framework made compassionate, effective responses nearly impossible. Addicted individuals faced social ostracism, legal persecution, and religious condemnation, but received virtually no medical help. The punitive approach prevented people from seeking treatment even when they wanted to stop using cocaine. Admitting addiction meant risking arrest, job loss, and social exile. Colombia entered the cocaine business almost accidentally in the 1960s through a combination of geography, agricultural tradition, and American drug policy failures that created market conditions perfect for an industry that would eventually dwarf the country's entire legal economy. The Andean region, where Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia meet, had cultivated coca plants for over 4,000 years, but indigenous peoples chewed the leaves for mild stimulation, nothing remotely comparable to the concentrated cocaine flooding American cities. Converting coca leaves into cocaine hydrochloride required chemical expertise, laboratory equipment, and distribution networks that didn't exist in rural South America. Then Chilean chemist Carlos Leda figured out the process could be industrialized, and everything changed. The marijuana smuggling networks of the 1970s provided the infrastructure cocaine traffickers would later exploit. American demand for marijuana had created smuggling routes from Colombia to Florida using small planes, speedboats, and corrupt officials on both ends. These routes moved relatively bulky, low-value marijuana by the ton. Cocaine offered dramatically better economics. A single kilogram sold for 10 to 20 times more than a kilogram of marijuana, while occupying the same space and weighing considerably less. Smugglers who'd been risking federal prison to transport marijuana realized they could make 10 times the profit transporting cocaine with identical risk. The shift was inevitable. Pablo Escobar emerged from Medellin's criminal underworld in the mid-1970s as an ambitious smuggler willing to use extreme violence to eliminate competition. He started stealing cars and gravestones before transitioning to cocaine trafficking. Escobar recognized early that controlling production and distribution from coca fields to American streets would generate obscene profits. He established coca processing laboratories in Colombia's jungles, negotiated with Peruvian and Bolivian coca farmers, and built a distribution network stretching from South America through Central America and Mexico into the United States. By 1982, his Medellin cartel was smuggling 15 tons of cocaine into America monthly. The Medellin cartel's daily revenue at its peak reached $60 million, not annually, not monthly, but every single day. This figure is almost incomprehensible. Escobar earned more money from cocaine in 24 hours than most Fortune 500 companies made in a year. His organization had to spend $2,500 weekly just on rubber bands to wrap cash bundles. They lost approximately 10% of their money annually to rats eating currency stored in warehouses and to bills rotting from water damage in hidden stashes. Losing billions to vermin and decay wasn't even a concern because the cartel generated money faster than they could possibly spend or launder it. Escobar's transportation methods evolved from crude to sophisticated as law enforcement adapted. Early shipments involved small planes flying cocaine directly from Colombia to remote Florida airstrips. When the U.S. Coast Guard increased patrols, the cartel switched to speedboats making high-speed runs through Caribbean waters. When that became too risky, they used commercial shipping containers on legitimate cargo vessels. The cartel employed submarines, actual military-grade submarines, by the late 1980s. These vessels could carry 10 tons of cocaine while running completely submerged, making them nearly impossible to detect. Each submarine cost approximately $2 million to build, but a single successful voyage generated $200 million in revenue. Money laundering became the cartel's biggest logistical challenge. Escobar couldn't simply deposit billions in Colombian banks without attracting attention. The cartel established hundreds of front businesses, taxi companies, restaurants, construction firms, farms, soccer teams. They purchased enormous amounts of real estate using shell corporations. They smuggled cash into international banks in Panama, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands. Some money was physically transported back to Colombia in shipping containers alongside legitimate goods. Despite these efforts, Escobar still had more cash than he could launder. He buried millions in fields and mountains, built secret vaults in properties across Colombia, and literally buried currency in walls when he ran out of storage space. The Colombian government initially underestimated Escobar and the cartel's threat. Politicians viewed cocaine as an American problem. If Americans wanted to destroy themselves with drugs, that was their concern. This attitude changed rapidly as Escobar expanded his political influence through a strategy he called plata o plomo, silver or lead, bribes or bullets. Government officials could accept cartel money and live wealthy lives, or they could refuse and die. Judges who prosecuted cartel members were assassinated along with their families. Police officers who arrested cartel enforcers were killed. Journalists who investigated cartel activities were murdered. Between 1984 and 1990, the Medellin cartel killed over 4,000 people in Colombia, including half the country's Supreme Court justices. Escobar's most audacious act of terrorism occurred in November 1989, when the cartel bombed Avianca Flight 203, a commercial airliner flying from Bogotá to Cali. The plane exploded mid-air, killing all 107 passengers and crew, plus 3 people on the ground struck by falling debris. Escobar's target was presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, who had pledged to extradite cartel leaders to the United States. Gaviria wasn't on the flight. He'd changed his plans at the last moment. Escobar murdered 110 innocent people in a failed assassination attempt and faced no legal consequences because the Colombian justice system was too terrified and too corrupted to prosecute him. The cartel's corruption extended into every Colombian institution. Escobar paid military officers to ignore cocaine laboratories and smuggling operations. He bribed police chiefs to release arrested cartel members. He funded political campaigns for candidates who opposed extradition treaties with the United States. At one point, Escobar was elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Chamber of Representatives, giving him parliamentary immunity. He attempted to legitimize himself through public works, building housing for the poor, constructing soccer fields in Medellin slums, distributing money directly to impoverished families. Poor Colombians loved him for this charity work, calling him Robin Hood. They didn't see or didn't care that his generosity was funded by destroying American communities with cocaine. American cocaine consumption exploded during the 1980s, fueling the cartel's growth and guaranteeing Escobar's power. Middle-class professionals discovered cocaine enhanced their work performance and social confidence. Wall Street traders used it to maintain focus during 16-hour work days. Hollywood celebrities made it fashionable. The drug shed its association with urban poverty and became a status symbol. Cocaine use was so widespread and socially acceptable among young professionals that it earned the nickname Wall Street's drug of choice. America's insatiable appetite for cocaine made Escobar one of the world's wealthiest men, while American politicians declared a war on drugs that accomplished absolutely nothing. The Medellin cartel's violence escalated as the Colombian government finally began serious enforcement efforts under pressure from the United States. Car bombs exploded in Bogotá and Medellin with increasing frequency. The cartel bombed the headquarters of Colombia's intelligence agency, killing 63 people and injuring over 600. They bombed a shopping center. They bombed newspaper offices. They bombed government buildings. The terrorism aimed to pressure Colombia into abandoning extradition treaties that would have sent cartel leaders to American prisons. Escobar understood he could commit any crime in Colombia with impunity due to corruption and intimidation, but American courts would actually convict him. Los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, emerged in 1992 as a vigilante organization targeting Escobar's family, lawyers, and associates. This group wasn't random civilians seeking justice. They were funded and supported by the Cali cartel, Escobar's rival organization, with assistance from Colombian security forces and likely the CIA. Los Pepes firebombed Escobar's properties, murdered his lawyers, killed his associates, and hunted his family. They operated with complete impunity, enjoying protection from elements within the Colombian government who viewed them as a useful tool against Escobar, even though they were simply another criminal organization. Escobar went into hiding in 1992 as Los Pepes, and the Colombian government's search block hunted him relentlessly. He moved between safe houses in Medellin, rarely staying in one location more than a day or two. His empire was collapsing, assets frozen, associates arrested or killed, smuggling routes interdicted. Yet cocaine continued flowing into the United States almost uninterrupted because the infrastructure he'd built operated independently. The Medellin cartel had become too large and too distributed for Escobar's capture to significantly impact cocaine availability. This revealed the fundamental futility of targeting individual drug lords. The market demand guaranteed someone would always fill the supply role. Colombian police killed Pablo Escobar on December 2, 1993, during a shootout on a Medellin rooftop as he tried to escape after authorities traced his phone call to his family. He died at age 44, having accumulated an estimated net worth of $30 billion, making him one of the wealthiest criminals in history. Thousands of Medellin's poor residents attended his funeral, mourning the man who'd given them houses and money while ignoring or not understanding that his cocaine trade had destroyed millions of lives across 2 continents. His death was celebrated in the United States as a major victory in the war on drugs. It meant absolutely nothing. The Cali cartel immediately filled the void left by the Medellin cartel's collapse. Led by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers and José Santa Cruz Londoño, the Cali cartel operated with a completely different philosophy than Escobar's approach. They avoided spectacular violence and assassinations, instead focusing on sophisticated bribery and legitimate business integration. The Cali cartel infiltrated Colombian banking, invested heavily in legitimate businesses, and corrupted officials at the highest government levels. They controlled approximately 80% of the global cocaine market by 1995. Their revenue was estimated at $7 billion annually, enough to rank as Colombia's 3rd largest revenue source after coffee and oil exports. The Cali cartel's sophistication extended to their distribution networks. They employed accountants, lawyers, and business consultants. They used encrypted communications before most businesses understood the technology. They established cocaine distribution cells throughout the United States that operated like franchise businesses. Each cell operated semi-independently, reducing the cartel's exposure if any single cell was compromised. They diversified beyond cocaine into heroin production when they recognized American opioid markets offered similar profit potential. The Cali cartel represented the evolution of drug trafficking from violent entrepreneurship into corporate-style organized crime. Colombian cocaine production continued expanding even as law enforcement successfully disrupted individual cartels. When the Cali cartel leadership was arrested in the mid-1990s, dozens of smaller organizations emerged to continue cocaine production and trafficking. These groups, the North Valley Cartel, various Medellin successor organizations, operated more quietly but no less effectively. Colombia remained the world's largest cocaine producer, with coca cultivation reaching over 160,000 hectares by 2000. The war on drugs has successfully arrested or killed dozens of cartel leaders while accomplishing exactly nothing in terms of reducing cocaine availability or price. The paramilitaries added another layer of violence and complexity to Colombia's cocaine landscape. Right-wing paramilitary groups like the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, AUC, initially formed to fight Marxist guerrillas, but quickly became involved in cocaine trafficking to fund their operations. These paramilitaries controlled large rural areas where coca was grown and processed. They taxed cocaine production, protected laboratories, and sometimes operated their own trafficking networks. The FARC guerrillas, originally a communist insurgent movement, similarly became involved in cocaine production by taxing coca farmers in territories they controlled. By the late 1990s, Colombia's cocaine industry funded both sides of the country's brutal internal conflict. American cocaine consumption remained remarkably stable throughout the rise and fall of Colombian cartels. The retail price of cocaine in US cities barely fluctuated despite massive interdiction efforts. Purity levels remained high. Availability never declined. This revealed an uncomfortable truth. The supply-side approach to drug policy was fundamentally flawed. As long as American demand existed, someone somewhere would produce and transport cocaine regardless of law enforcement efforts. Disrupting one cartel simply created opportunities for competitors. Arresting drug lords didn't reduce drug availability because the cartels operated more like corporations than personality-driven criminal enterprises. Removing the CEO didn't shut down the company. Someone discovered in 1984 that mixing cocaine powder with baking soda and water, then heating the mixture until it solidified into rocks, created a product that could be smoked for an instant, overwhelming high that made powder cocaine seem gentle by comparison. This wasn't sophisticated chemistry. Any teenager with a stove could do it. The process removed the hydrochloride salt from cocaine, converting it into its freebase form with a lower vaporization temperature. Smoking delivered cocaine to the brain in seconds, faster even than intravenous injection. The resulting high lasted only 5 to 10 minutes, but was so intense that users described it as better than any experience in their lives, including sex. That brief euphoria came with a price: immediate, crushing depression when it ended, creating desperate craving for another hit within minutes. The economics of crack revolutionized cocaine distribution and destroyed communities that powder cocaine had largely spared. A gram of powder cocaine sold for $100 to $150 on the street in 1985. That same gram could be converted into crack and sold in $5 or $10 doses, generating $200 to $300 in revenue, while making the drug accessible to people who couldn't afford powder cocaine's price point. Dealers recognized the business model immediately. Crack created more customers. Those customers needed to buy more frequently, and addiction happened faster. Inner-city neighborhoods became open-air drug markets where crack was sold as casually as newspapers, with dealers posted on every corner and runners delivering product to regular customers. African-American communities suffered the crack epidemic's worst devastation, not because Black Americans were more susceptible to addiction, but because crack dealers targeted poor urban neighborhoods where powder cocaine hadn't gained significant market share. The drug appeared in Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, Chicago, and Miami almost simultaneously in late 1984 and early 1985. Within a year, crack had spread to virtually every American city, with a significant black population. The speed of crack's proliferation suggested coordinated distribution that went beyond independent dealers recognizing a business opportunity. Major trafficking organizations had clearly identified inner cities as their primary market and flooded those neighborhoods with product. Emergency rooms in urban hospitals were overwhelmed by crack-related admissions starting in 1986. Cardiac arrests in people under 30 years old increased by 300% in some cities. Strokes in young adults became common where they'd previously been rare. Cocaine-induced psychosis filled psychiatric wards beyond capacity. Women began arriving in labour already high on crack, giving birth to babies who went into immediate withdrawal, shaking, screaming, unable to feed properly. These crack babies suffered developmental problems, learning disabilities, and behavioural issues. The medical system had no effective treatments for infants born addicted to crack. Hospitals could only manage symptoms and hope the children's developing brains would compensate for the damage. Crack's addictive properties exceeded anything drug researchers had previously documented. Powder cocaine was certainly addictive, but many users maintained some level of controlled use for months or years before spiralling into severe addiction. Crack eliminated that progression. Users often became addicted after their first or second experience. The drug's short duration of effect created a compulsive redosing pattern. Users would smoke crack continuously for hours or days in binges that lasted until they ran out of money, drugs, or physical stamina. These binges destroyed users' ability to maintain jobs, relationships, or any semblance of normal life within weeks of starting crack use. Crack houses emerged as a new category of urban horror. These were abandoned buildings, condemned apartments, or foreclosed homes where users gathered to smoke crack continuously. The scenes inside defied description. Dozens of people crammed into filthy rooms, pipes being passed around, sex traded for drugs, violence erupting over minor disputes. Crack house operators made money by renting space and selling drugs on site. Users would stay for days without leaving, lost in cycles of smoking, crashing, and smoking again. Children sometimes wandered through crack houses looking for their parents. Bodies of users who overdosed or died from medical emergencies were occasionally left in corners for hours before anyone bothered to call authorities. The crack trade generated violence that made previous drug-related crimes seem almost quaint. Crack dealing was tremendously profitable, but also required holding physical territory, street corners, apartment buildings, entire blocks. Rival gangs fought brutal wars for control of these territories. Drive-by shootings became common as dealers attacked competitors. Innocent bystanders caught in crossfire included children playing outside, elderly residents sitting on porches, and people simply walking to work or school. Between 1985 and 1989, homicide rates in American cities increased by over 50%, with the vast majority of additional murders related to crack trade violence. Los Angeles street gangs, particularly the Crips and Bloods, became major crack distribution organizations with national reach. These gangs had existed since the 1960s, but were relatively small criminal enterprises focused on local crime. Crack transformed them into sophisticated drug trafficking operations with members in dozens of cities. LA gang members established crack distribution networks throughout the United States, from Seattle to Boston, setting up operations wherever they identified markets. The gangs brought LA's violent culture with them, introducing drive-by shootings and open gang warfare to cities that had never experienced such concentrated urban violence. Women faced particular horror in crack-saturated neighborhoods. Female addicts traded sex for crack so frequently that the practice had its own terminology, strawberries, or crack whores. Many became trapped in cycles where they would exchange sex for a single hit of crack, experience a brief high, then immediately need to find another customer for another hit. This continued for hours or days. Many contracted HIV during this period as crack's appearance coincided with the AIDS epidemic's peak. The combination of compulsive sex work, reduced judgment from drug intoxication, and limited condom use created perfect conditions for HIV transmission. Studies in some cities found HIV infection rates above 40% among female crack users by 1990. Children grew up in environments saturated with crack, witnessing their parents' addiction and often being neglected or abandoned as a result. Schools in crack-affected neighborhoods reported dramatic increases in student behavioral problems, learning difficulties, and attendance issues. Some children became involved in the drug trade directly. Dealers used kids as young as 10 or 12 as lookouts and runners because juvenile criminal penalties were minimal compared to adult sentences. These children absorbed the trade's violence, seeing murder and drug dealing as normal business practices. A generation was being socialized into criminal lifestyles before reaching adolescence. Foster care systems in major cities collapsed under the weight of crack's family destruction. Parents lost custody after being arrested for possession, after Child Protective Services found them smoking crack while children were present, or after children were left alone for days while parents went on binges. The number of children in foster care doubled in many jurisdictions between 1985 and 1990. Foster families couldn't be found for all these children. Some ended up in group homes or institutional settings. Others were placed with relatives who were also struggling with poverty and sometimes addiction. The crack epidemic created orphans whose parents were still alive but had been chemically transformed into people incapable of basic parenting. The government's response to the crack epidemic represented one of the most racist policy decisions in modern American history. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established mandatory minimum sentences for drug offences with a stunning disparity. Possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine carried the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence as possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine. This 100-to-1 sentencing disparity had no scientific justification. Crack and powder cocaine are the same drug in different forms. The disparity existed because crack was associated with poor black neighborhoods, while powder cocaine was associated with wealthy white users. This sentencing disparity's consequences were catastrophic and targeted. Federal prisoners serving sentences for crack offences were approximately 85% African American, even though studies showed roughly equal crack use rates across racial groups. Young black men were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned at rates that devastated entire communities. By 1995, 1 in 3 black men in their 20s was under criminal justice supervision, in prison, on probation, or on parole. These weren't violent criminals or major traffickers. Most were low-level dealers or simple possessors serving draconian sentences because of mandatory minimums that judges couldn't override, even when they recognized the sentences were absurdly harsh. Families disintegrated under the combined weight of addiction and mass incarceration. A typical pattern: father goes to prison for crack possession, mother becomes primary parent while struggling with poverty, mother develops crack addiction, children go into foster care, or both parents go to prison simultaneously, children raised by grandparents who are elderly and poor. These disruptions caused intergenerational trauma that affected children's development, educational outcomes, and future economic prospects. Communities lost entire cohorts of young adults to prison, creating neighborhoods where 20% or more of working-age men were incarcerated at any given time. The crack epidemic demonstrated law enforcement's fundamental inadequacy as a response to drug addiction. Police made tens of thousands of arrests, but this had no impact on crack availability. Street-level dealers who were arrested were immediately replaced by other desperate people who needed money. Major traffickers rarely faced prosecution because they insulated themselves behind layers of subordinates. Prisons filled to bursting with non-violent drug offenders, while crack use remained steady. Courts were overwhelmed with drug cases, delaying prosecution of other crimes. The entire criminal justice system was redirected toward punishing crack possession, while accomplishing nothing in terms of reducing addiction or availability. Treatment options remained inadequate and underfunded throughout the crack epidemic's worst years. Publicly funded treatment centers had waiting lists of months or years. Many crack addicts who wanted help couldn't access it. Private treatment facilities charged fees that poor addicts couldn't pay. The few available treatment programs had limited understanding of crack addiction's specific challenges. Most programs were designed for alcohol or heroin addiction and didn't address crack's unique pattern of rapid, compulsive redosing and intense craving. Success rates were abysmal. Most patients relapsed within weeks or months of completing treatment. Media coverage of the crack epidemic was sensationalized and often overtly racist, creating moral panic that supported punitive policies rather than public health responses. News broadcasts showed footage of black men being arrested in dramatic police raids. Newspapers published articles about crack babies that were later proven to be largely based on flawed science and racial stereotypes. Politicians used crack as a campaign issue, competing to appear tough on crime by supporting ever harsher penalties. This political theatre served careers but destroyed lives. The war on drugs became a war on poor black communities, with crack serving as the justification. By 1990, crack had fundamentally altered the landscape of American drug use and drug policy. The drug had killed thousands directly through overdose and cardiac arrest. It had killed thousands more indirectly through violence, HIV transmission, and the destruction of communities' social fabric. Mass incarceration had removed hundreds of thousands of people from their families and neighborhoods. An entire generation of children had grown up surrounded by addiction, violence, and instability. The crack epidemic revealed everything wrong with America's approach to drug policy: the racism, the focus on punishment over treatment, the refusal to address root causes like poverty and lack of opportunity. And the same failed policies continued unchanged, because admitting failure would require acknowledging that the war on drugs had always been less about drugs and more about social control. The United States launched its modern war on drugs in 1971 when President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. But the campaign reached its peak intensity during the 1980s and 1990s, with budgets exceeding $15 billion annually and a single-minded focus on supply-side interdiction that proved spectacularly ineffective at every measurable objective. The Drug Enforcement Administration expanded from 1,500 agents in 1973 to over 5,000 by 1990. The Coast Guard devoted half its operating budget to drug interdiction. The military became involved in drug enforcement operations despite the Posse Comitatus Act, traditionally restricting military involvement in domestic law enforcement. This massive mobilization of resources, personnel, and political will achieved essentially nothing except filling prisons and enriching cartels. Cocaine seizures increased dramatically throughout the 1980s, with federal agents interdicting tons of cocaine at borders, ports, and airports. These seizures were celebrated as victories and used to justify continued funding. The actual impact on cocaine availability was negligible. For every ton seized, cartels simply shipped more to compensate for losses they treated as a business expense. Economic analysis revealed that cartels needed to successfully deliver only 10% to 15% of their cocaine shipments to remain profitable given the drug's enormous markup from production to retail sale. Interdiction would have needed to stop 85% to 90% of cocaine shipments to significantly impact cartel economics. Actual interdiction rates never exceeded 20% and usually ran closer to 10%. Operation Snowcap deployed DEA agents to Bolivia and Peru in 1987 to attack cocaine production at its source by destroying coca fields and processing laboratories. Agents burned fields, demolished labs, and arrested processors. Peasant farmers simply replanted coca in different locations. Lab operators rebuilt their facilities within weeks. The operation cost hundreds of millions of dollars and achieved nothing permanent. Coca cultivation increased during every year of Operation Snowcap's existence because the underlying economic incentives remained unchanged. Coca was far more profitable than any legal crop farmers could grow in the Andean region. Plan Colombia, launched in 2000, represented the United States' most ambitious attempt to destroy cocaine production through military-style intervention. The US provided over $10 billion to the Colombian government for military equipment, training, and operations against cocaine traffickers and the guerrilla groups that protected them. American contractors flew planes spraying herbicides over coca fields, destroying crops and occasionally poisoning legitimate farms. Colombian military forces attacked FARC camps and interdicted cocaine shipments. The plan succeeded in reducing violence and weakening guerrilla groups, but cocaine production simply migrated to other regions within Colombia and increased in Peru and Bolivia. Total cocaine production across the Andean region remained essentially unchanged. Mexican cartels emerged as dominant players in cocaine trafficking during the 1990s after Colombian cartels were disrupted. Mexican organizations initially worked as transporters, moving Colombian cocaine across the Mexico-US border in exchange for fees. As Colombian cartels weakened, Mexican groups took control of the entire supply chain. The Guadalajara cartel fragmented into multiple competing organizations: the Sinaloa cartel, the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, the Gulf cartel. These groups proved even more violent and ruthless than their Colombian predecessors, initiating a period of warfare that would kill over 150,000 people in Mexico between 2006 and 2020. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán built the Sinaloa cartel into the world's most powerful drug trafficking organization through a combination of strategic violence, sophisticated logistics, and extensive corruption. El Chapo pioneered the use of tunnels under the Mexico-US border, constructing elaborate passages complete with lighting, ventilation, and rail systems for moving drugs. His organization employed engineers, architects, and construction crews who built tunnels that would have impressed mining companies. Some tunnels stretched over half a mile and reached 70 feet underground. Border Patrol and DEA agents would discover and destroy these tunnels, only to have the cartel construct new ones within months. The Sinaloa cartel's corruption network extended deep into Mexican government, military, and law enforcement. Guzman paid millions in bribes to officials at every level. Prison guards were on the cartel payroll. Police chiefs provided intelligence about rival cartel operations. Military officers warned the cartel about upcoming raids. When El Chapo was first arrested in 1993, he continued running his organization from inside Mexico's highest security prison through bribed guards who provided phones, allowed visits from associates, and gave him luxury accommodations. He escaped in 2001 by walking out of the prison hidden in a laundry cart after paying off guards, officials, and administrators. The escape was so brazen it could only have succeeded with extensive official cooperation. Violence between Mexican cartels escalated to levels that shocked even experienced drug war observers. Competing organizations fought for control of smuggling routes and territories, using tactics that resembled military operations more than typical criminal violence. Gunmen armed with assault rifles, grenades, and rocket-propelled grenades engaged in battles that left dozens dead. Cartels established training camps where recruits received military-style instruction. Some cartels recruited former Mexican Special Forces soldiers and former Guatemalan Special Operations troops who brought professional military expertise to drug trafficking organizations. The Zetas cartel originated as the enforcement arm of the Gulf cartel in the late 1990s, comprised of former Mexican Special Forces soldiers who deserted to work for drug traffickers. These weren't street criminals who happened to be violent. They were elite military operators with expertise in weapons, tactics, and intelligence. The Zetas eventually broke away from the Gulf Cartel and became an independent organization that controlled territories through systematic terrorism. They pioneered new levels of brutality designed to intimidate rivals and civilians: mass kidnappings, public executions, beheadings, dismemberment, and the disposal of bodies in acid or by burning. Cartel violence deliberately targeted civilians, journalists, and government officials to create an atmosphere of total terror. Newspapers that reported on cartel activities had their offices attacked and reporters murdered. Mayors and police chiefs who resisted cartel control were assassinated along with their families. Innocent people were kidnapped from buses and forced to fight each other to the death for cartel members' entertainment. Bodies were hung from highway overpasses with threatening messages. Mass graves containing hundreds of victims were discovered in areas under cartel control. The violence served both tactical purposes, eliminating opposition and demonstrating power, and strategic goals of making the Mexican state appear weak and unable to protect citizens. Ciudad Juarez became the epicenter of Mexico's drug war violence between 2008 and 2012, earning the distinction as one of the world's most dangerous cities. The Sinaloa cartel and Juarez cartel fought a brutal war for control of the city's crucial border crossing into El Paso, Texas. Over 10,000 people were murdered in Juarez during this period. Bodies appeared on streets daily. Police found mass graves in the desert surrounding the city. Businesses closed because owners were extorted or killed. Residents who could afford to leave fled across the border. The Mexican military deployed thousands of troops to the city, but the violence continued largely unabated because soldiers were outgunned, outnumbered, and often corrupted by cartel money. The Mexican government launched a full-scale military offensive against cartels in 2006 under President Felipe Calderón, deploying tens of thousands of troops to combat zones and engaging cartels in direct military operations. The strategy succeeded in arresting or killing numerous cartel leaders, but created a Hydra effect. Each disrupted cartel fractured into smaller organizations that fought each other for control of the parent cartel's former territory. Violence increased rather than decreased. Between 2006 and 2012, approximately 60,000 people died in drug war violence in Mexico. The military offensive demonstrated the same problem as US interdiction efforts. Targeting supply without addressing demand simply created chaos without reducing drug trafficking. El Chapo's 2016 recapture and subsequent extradition to the United States was celebrated as a major victory. He was convicted in US federal court and sentenced to life imprisonment plus 30 years. The Sinaloa cartel continued operating without interruption. His sons took over leadership roles. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl continued flowing across the border in roughly the same quantities as before his arrest. The cartel had evolved into an institution that transcended any individual leader. Removing El Chapo was like removing a single manager from Walmart. The company continues functioning because it's a system, not a person. Central American countries became casualties of the drug war as cartels established smuggling routes through Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These countries lacked resources to combat wealthy, well-armed trafficking organizations. Cartels corrupted local police, intimidated judges, and recruited gang members as enforcers and distributors. Honduras became a major cocaine transshipment point, with small planes landing on remote airstrips and coastal areas. Guatemala's vast, sparsely populated regions provided perfect territory for cocaine storage and movement. El Salvador's MS-13 gang allied with Mexican cartels, providing distribution networks in exchange for drug supplies. The violence exported to Central America contributed to a massive refugee crisis, as civilians fled territories controlled by cartels and gangs. Families in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador faced extortion demands, forced recruitment of children into criminal organizations, and random violence. Those who couldn't pay extortion were killed. Those who resisted gang recruitment saw their children murdered. Hundreds of thousands of Central Americans migrated northward toward the United States, creating a humanitarian crisis at the Mexico-US border. American politicians debated immigration policy without acknowledging that US drug consumption and drug policy had directly created the violence driving migration. Cocaine prices in American cities remained remarkably stable throughout decades of aggressive interdiction, providing clear evidence that supply-side enforcement had failed. A gram of cocaine cost approximately $100 to $150 in 1985 and remained in roughly the same price range adjusted for inflation through 2020. If interdiction efforts had significantly reduced supply, basic economics dictates that prices should have increased dramatically. Stable prices indicated stable supply despite billions spent on enforcement. Purity levels also remained high, further confirming that cocaine scarcity was never achieved. The market had simply absorbed enforcement pressure as a cost of doing business. The social costs of the war on drugs extended beyond direct violence and incarceration. Corruption spread throughout law enforcement and government as drug money bought officials on both sides of the border. Trust in institutions eroded as citizens watched police and politicians either fail to combat cartels or actively cooperate with them. The rule of law became a fiction in territories under cartel control. Economic development stagnated in regions consumed by drug violence as businesses closed, investment fled, and talented people emigrated. The war on drugs created failed state conditions in some regions despite governments nominally maintaining sovereignty. American demand for cocaine never significantly declined despite decades of prevention campaigns, treatment programs, and harsh criminal penalties for users. Cocaine use patterns shifted across demographics and regions, but total consumption remained relatively constant. When crack use declined in inner cities during the 1990s, powder cocaine use increased among suburban and rural whites. The drug cycled through different user populations while maintaining steady overall demand. This pattern revealed an uncomfortable truth. Drug prohibition did not reduce drug use. It simply determined who sold drugs, how much violence accompanied distribution, and who went to prison. Cocaine remained a Schedule II controlled substance throughout the entire epidemic, classified alongside morphine and methamphetamine as having legitimate medical applications despite high abuse potential. This meant hospitals could legally stock pharmaceutical-grade cocaine, while police arrested street dealers for distributing chemically identical compounds. The absurdity of this dual status highlighted fundamental contradictions in drug policy. The same molecule was simultaneously essential medicine and dangerous contraband depending entirely on context and who controlled its distribution. The distinction wasn't scientific or pharmacological but purely social and legal. Ear, nose, and throat surgeons continued using cocaine as a topical anesthetic for procedures involving nasal passages and throat tissues. The drug's unique combination of anesthetic properties and vasoconstriction made it valuable for reducing bleeding during surgery. Pharmaceutical companies produce sterile cocaine solutions specifically for medical use. These preparations were identical to street cocaine in chemical composition, but came with precise dosing, quality control, and legitimate supply chains. A single hospital procedure might use 100 to 200 milligrams of pharmaceutical cocaine, roughly the same amount as 2 lines of street cocaine. Yet this was completely legal and medically appropriate. Eye surgeons employed cocaine solutions for certain ophthalmological procedures taking advantage of the drug's ability to dilate pupils and numb eye tissues. The irony was staggering. A doctor could legally apply cocaine to a patient's eye, while that same patient could face years in prison for possessing cocaine outside the medical setting. The medical use wasn't a loophole or aberration. Cocaine was genuinely useful for these specific applications because no alternative drugs perfectly replicated its combination of anesthesia and blood vessel constriction. Medicine had found legitimate uses for a drug that destroyed millions of lives when used recreationally. This paradox forced an uncomfortable question that drug warriors consistently refused to address. If cocaine was safe enough for hospitals to use on conscious patients, including children undergoing ear surgery, why did possession of the same substance outside medical settings justify draconian criminal penalties? The standard response, that medical use was controlled and supervised, merely highlighted that context and dose-determined outcomes, not the drug's inherent properties. A rational drug policy would acknowledge this reality and adjust accordingly. Instead, the legal system maintained the fiction that cocaine was simultaneously an acceptable medicine and an unacceptable recreational substance. Portugal's radical 2001 decision to decriminalize all drugs provided real-world data on alternatives to criminalization that directly contradicted decades of prohibition orthodoxy. Portuguese law stopped treating drug possession as a criminal offence, instead treating it as an administrative violation similar to a parking ticket. Individuals caught with drugs faced no arrest, no criminal record, no jail time. They received mandatory meetings with dissuasion commissions, comprising social workers, psychologists, and legal advisors who assessed whether the person needed treatment. Those with addiction problems were offered, not forced into, treatment programs. The results in Portugal demolished every argument prohibition advocates had made about the necessity of criminal penalties. Drug-induced deaths plummeted from 80 per million in 2001 to 6 per million by 2012, among the lowest rates in Europe. HIV infection rates among drug users dropped by over 90% as users could access clean needles without fear of arrest. Drug use rates among adolescents declined as drug dealing lost its rebellious appeal. Most dramatically, the decriminalization didn't cause the predicted explosion in drug use. Rates remained stable or declined compared to European countries maintaining prohibition. Portugal proved that treating addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal justice problem produced objectively better outcomes across every metric. Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment program, launched in 1994, represented an even more radical departure from prohibition orthodoxy by providing pharmaceutical-grade heroin to severe addicts who had failed other treatment approaches. Addicts received supervised injections of pure heroin in clinical settings twice daily. The program didn't aim for abstinence but for harm reduction, keeping users alive, reducing crime, and improving health outcomes. Results were stunning. Criminal activity among participants dropped by 60%. Employment rates doubled, and health improved dramatically as users stopped injecting street drugs of unknown purity. Switzerland eventually expanded the program nationwide after voters approved it, in a 2008 referendum with 68% support. The Swiss approach acknowledged a reality American drug policy refused to accept. Some addicts cannot or will not achieve abstinence, and society must decide whether to help these people or abandon them. Prohibition effectively chose abandonment. Addicts were criminalized, imprisoned, and left to cycle through emergency rooms until they died. Harm reduction prioritized keeping addicts alive and minimizing damage to themselves and society. The approach seemed counterintuitive, giving addicts the very drug destroying their lives. But the data was unequivocal. Supervised heroin provision reduced deaths, disease, crime, and social costs more effectively than any prohibition-based intervention. Vancouver's Insight Facility, North America's first legal supervised injection site, opened in 2003 in Canada's downtown east side amid fierce opposition from prohibition advocates who claimed it would increase drug use and attract addicts to the neighborhood. The facility provided sterile equipment and medical supervision for drug users who brought their own drugs to inject on site. Nurses monitored for overdoses and intervened immediately when they occurred. Users could access addiction treatment and social services. No one died from overdose at Insight during its first decade of operation, despite over 1.8 million injections. Hundreds of lives saved through a program that didn't even attempt to stop drug use, only to make it safer. Insight's surrounding neighborhood saw crime decrease, not increase as opponents had predicted. Users stopped injecting in alleys and public spaces. Discarded needles virtually disappeared from streets and playgrounds. Ambulance calls for overdoses dropped significantly, as overdoses happening inside Insight were managed on site without emergency transport. The facility cost approximately $3 million annually to operate, but saved an estimated $6 million in healthcare and criminal justice expenses. Every harm reduction metric improved. The only negative outcome was political. Conservative politicians attacked the facility despite overwhelming evidence of its effectiveness. The fundamental insight underlying harm reduction was that drug policy should minimize total harm rather than eliminate drug use, which was demonstrably impossible after a century of failed prohibition efforts. Traditional abstinence-only approaches condemned many addicts to death because they couldn't maintain sobriety and faced criminalization that prevented them from accessing help. Harm reduction accepted that some people would continue using drugs regardless of consequences and focused on keeping them alive long enough to potentially recover. This pragmatic approach offended moral absolutists who viewed any accommodation of drug use as surrender. Needle exchange programs illustrated harm reduction's effectiveness and the irrational opposition it faced. HIV and hepatitis C spread rapidly among injection drug users sharing contaminated needles. Providing sterile needles prevented disease transmission without increasing drug use. Study after study confirmed this. Yet American politicians blocked needle exchange funding for decades based on the absurd claim that clean needles enabled drug use. This forced addicts to reuse and share needles, spreading HIV and hepatitis that then cost millions to treat. The policy killed people to make a moral point. Drug checking services at music festivals and nightclubs allowed users to test substances for dangerous adulterants and unexpected compounds, preventing overdose deaths from drugs contaminated with fentanyl or toxic cutting agents. These services operated openly in some European countries, providing rapid analysis that identified dangerous substances and allowed users to make informed decisions. American festivals couldn't offer similar services without risking prosecution for facilitating drug use. This forced festival attendees to consume drugs of completely unknown composition, guaranteeing preventable deaths that drug checking would have avoided. Medication-assisted treatment for cocaine addiction remained underdeveloped compared to opioid addiction treatments like methadone and buprenorphine, because cocaine's mechanism of action presented different challenges and because research funding prioritized opioids. No medication perfectly substituted for cocaine's effects while blocking craving. Researchers tested various approaches: dopamine agonists, stimulants, vaccines, with limited success. Some cocaine addicts responded to behavioral therapies, but relapse rates remained high. The lack of effective pharmaceutical interventions meant cocaine addiction remained extraordinarily difficult to treat, even for motivated individuals seeking help. The criminalization of drug use created barriers to treatment that guaranteed worse outcomes than medical approaches would have achieved. Addicts avoided seeking help because doing so could result in arrest, job loss, child custody loss, or professional license revocation. Emergency room physicians were required to report drug-related injuries to police in some jurisdictions, discouraging addicts from seeking medical care. Insurance companies denied coverage for addiction treatment or imposed lifetime limits that forced people into inadequate programs. The system punished addiction rather than treating it as the chronic relapsing brain disease that neuroscience had proven it to be. American drug courts emerged in the 1990s as an attempt to divert non-violent drug offenders from prison into treatment, but they replicated many problems they were supposed to solve. Drug courts required participants to plead guilty before entering treatment programs that often emphasized punishment and surveillance over evidence-based addiction medicine. Participants faced frequent drug testing with immediate jail sanctions for any positive result, despite relapse being a normal part of recovery. Judges with no medical training made treatment decisions. Success rates were modest, and many participants ended up incarcerated anyway after failing to meet program requirements that set many up for failure. The war on drugs created a treatment industrial complex that profited from addiction while providing frequently ineffective services. Private treatment centers charged tens of thousands of dollars for 28-day programs based on obsolete approaches and pseudoscientific theories. Many facilities were essentially luxury hotels that provided counseling but no medical care, despite addiction being a medical condition. Insurance companies paid these facilities enormous sums while denying coverage for evidence-based treatments, like medication-assisted therapy. Outcome data was rarely collected or published because it would reveal how poorly most programs performed. Racial disparities in treatment access were as severe as disparities in incarceration. White suburbanites caught with cocaine received treatment referrals and second chances. Black urbanites caught with crack went to prison for years. This wasn't accidental or incidental. The entire system was designed to criminalize black drug use while medicalizing white drug use. Politicians declared an opioid epidemic requiring treatment and compassion when prescription pills addicted white communities in the 2010s, after declaring a crack epidemic requiring imprisonment when cocaine addicted black communities in the 1980s. The drugs were different, but the addiction was identical. Only the racial demographics of users determined whether policy emphasized help or punishment. The scientific evidence supporting harm reduction and treatment over incarceration was overwhelming and had been for decades, yet American drug policy remained anchored to Prohibition orthodoxy. This persistence, despite contrary evidence, suggested drug policy was never really about reducing harm or helping addicts. The drug war served other purposes: controlling minority populations, enriching prison industries, providing political theatre for tough-on-crime candidates, and employing hundreds of thousands in law enforcement and corrections. Acknowledging that Prohibition had failed would threaten too many institutional interests and political careers, so the same failed policies continued, generation after generation, destroying lives while pretending to save them. Cocaine use in the 2020s exists in a strange twilight zone where the drug is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, hidden in plain sight among professionals who can afford high-quality product and sophisticated enough to avoid the criminal justice consequences that still devastate poor communities caught with the exact same substance. Investment bankers snort lines in Wall Street bathrooms between meetings. Tech executives microdose at Silicon Valley parties. Lawyers and doctors maintain functional habits while treating overdose victims and prosecuting dealers. The upper classes learned what elite Victorians knew in the 1880s. Cocaine can be used with relative safety if you have money for pure product, access to health care when things go wrong, and enough social capital to avoid prosecution. Global cocaine production reached record highs in recent years, despite more than a century of prohibition efforts that cost over $1 trillion and imprisoned millions of people. Colombia produced approximately 1,400 metric tons of cocaine in 2020, the highest level ever recorded. Peru and Bolivia contributed hundreds of additional metric tons. Total global production exceeded 2,000 metric tons annually, enough to supply every cocaine user on Earth multiple times over. The cartels had perfected industrial-scale production with efficiency that would impress legitimate manufacturing corporations. Coca cultivation adapted to enforcement pressure by moving to more remote regions, diversifying geographically, and developing higher-yield plant varieties. Mexican cartels evolved into transnational criminal enterprises, with operations spanning continents and revenue streams extending far beyond cocaine. The Jalisco New Generation cartel and remnants of the Sinaloa cartel controlled trafficking routes from South America through Central America and Mexico into the United States, while also operating in Europe, Asia, and Australia. These organizations trafficked methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, and marijuana alongside cocaine. They engaged in human smuggling, extortion, kidnapping, and money laundering. Cocaine remained important, but was just one product line in diversified criminal portfolios that generated tens of billions annually. Fentanyl and synthetic opioids created a new drug crisis that made cocaine look quaint by comparison, killing over 100,000 Americans annually by 2021. This death toll exceeded peak crack epidemic mortality by orders of magnitude. Fentanyl was 50 times more potent than heroin and could be manufactured entirely in laboratories without agricultural inputs, eliminating coca cultivation's geographic constraints. Chinese chemical companies produced precursor chemicals. Mexican cartels synthesized finished fentanyl in industrial labs. The synthetic opioid epidemic demonstrated that drug trafficking continuously adapted. When one drug became more difficult to produce or transport, traffickers simply switched to more profitable alternatives. American cocaine markets in the 2020s showed remarkably stable prices and high purity, despite decades of interdiction, proving conclusively that enforcement had failed to achieve meaningful supply reduction. A gram of cocaine in major cities cost roughly the same in real terms as it had in 1985, adjusted for inflation. Purity averaged 60% to 80%, compared to 40% to 50% in previous decades. Traffickers were providing better product at stable prices, indicating supply chains were more efficient than ever. This was the opposite of what Prohibition was supposed to achieve. The cartels had won the drug war by every economic metric. Cryptocurrency and darknet markets revolutionized drug distribution in the 2010s and 2020s, allowing anonymous transactions and direct mail delivery that bypassed traditional street-level dealing and much of law enforcement's interdiction infrastructure. Users could browse online catalogs of drugs with quality ratings and customer reviews, order from home, and receive packages via regular mail services. Law enforcement struggled to combat this distributed digital marketplace that had no physical location to raid and used encryption to protect user identities. Some dealers earned six-figure incomes operating entirely online, never meeting customers or handling cash. Cocaine's return to its elite origins created a paradox where the drug retained its illegal status while becoming socially acceptable in wealthy circles that functioned essentially above the law. Prosecutors rarely charged wealthy white professionals caught with personal use quantities of cocaine. When charges were filed, expensive lawyers negotiated diversion programs or minimal sentences. Poor people caught with identical amounts in poor neighborhoods faced years in prison for the same offense. The two-tier justice system meant cocaine prohibition was enforced selectively based on class and race, rather than universally based on law. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced the cracked powder cocaine sentencing disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, acknowledging the previous ratio was indefensible, but maintaining a disparity that still had no scientific justification and perpetuated racial discrimination. The law wasn't retroactive, leaving thousands of people serving sentences under the old guidelines. It took until 2018 for the First Step Act to make the reduced penalties retroactive, finally allowing some prisoners to petition for release after serving unconscionably long sentences for low-level drug offences. These legislative changes amounted to admissions that previous sentencing was wrong, yet no one was held accountable for implementing racist policies that destroyed communities. Legalization debates in the 2020s focused primarily on marijuana, while cocaine remained politically untouchable, demonstrating society's inconsistent approach to drug policy reform. Marijuana, arguably less harmful than alcohol, gained legal status in multiple states despite federal prohibition. Cocaine, demonstrably more dangerous but used by wealthy elites, remained completely illegal everywhere while facing minimal enforcement against affluent users. This inconsistency revealed that drug policy was based on politics and class, not pharmacology or public health. Society was willing to legalize drugs used primarily by middle-class whites, while maintaining prohibition on drugs associated with minorities and the poor. Academic research increasingly supported decriminalization and harm reduction for all drugs, including cocaine, based on evidence from Portugal, Switzerland, and other countries that had implemented these approaches. Studies showed criminal penalties didn't reduce drug use but did increase harm by driving users away from healthcare and social services. Researchers documented how prohibition enriched criminal organizations, corrupted governments, and generated violence without achieving meaningful reductions in drug availability or use. The scientific consensus was clear: prohibition had failed by every measure. Yet American politicians ignored this evidence because admitting failure would require dismantling the massive criminal justice infrastructure built around drug enforcement. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted cocaine trafficking temporarily in 2020, as border closures and lockdowns complicated smuggling operations, but traffickers adapted within months by shifting routes and methods, demonstrating the supply chain's resilience and flexibility. Cocaine prices spiked briefly in some markets, then returned to normal levels. The cartels proved more adaptable than legitimate businesses facing the same logistical challenges. This resilience illustrated why supply-side interdiction was futile. Criminal organizations operated with fewer constraints than legal businesses and could innovate more rapidly in response to obstacles. Cocaine-related deaths in the 2020s increasingly involved fentanyl contamination, as dealers cut cocaine with synthetic opioids to increase profit margins or due to cross-contamination in processing facilities. Users expecting stimulant effects instead received lethal opioid doses. These deaths revealed how prohibition created unpredictable, adulterated drug supplies that killed users who might have survived with pharmaceutical-grade substances. The deaths weren't caused by cocaine itself, but by the toxic adulterants that existed, only because the drug was illegal and unregulated. Treatment approaches for cocaine addiction in the 2020s remained largely ineffective despite advances in neuroscience, understanding of addiction mechanisms. No FDA-approved medications existed specifically for cocaine addiction. Behavioral therapies showed modest success rates. Most people who entered treatment relapsed within a year. The failure to develop effective treatments reflected both cocaine's complex pharmacology and the reality that prohibition diverted resources away from medical research toward law enforcement. Society spent billions incarcerating cocaine users while spending comparatively little helping them recover. The next generation of stimulants was already emerging from clandestine laboratories, as chemists synthesized novel compounds that mimicked cocaine's effects while technically remaining legal until governments added them to controlled substance lists. These research chemicals were sold openly online as not for human consumption to skirt drug laws. Users experimented with untested substances of completely unknown safety profiles. Some of these chemicals proved more dangerous than cocaine itself. Prohibition's game of whack-a-mole with new psychoactive substances demonstrated the futility of trying to ban chemistry. For every compound prohibited, chemists synthesized variants that temporarily remained legal. Environmental damage from cocaine production ravaged the Amazon rainforest as growers cleared jungle for coca cultivation and processors dumped toxic chemicals from cocaine extraction into rivers and soil. Coca cultivation required destroying rainforest to plant fields. Processing operations used sulfuric acid, kerosene, ammonia, and other toxic substances that were simply dumped into the environment. Colombia's coca-growing regions suffered severe environmental degradation. This ecological destruction was a direct consequence of prohibition. If cocaine were legal and regulated, it would be produced in controlled facilities with waste management rather than in jungle labs that treated the environment as a toxic waste dump. The human cost of cocaine's history defied calculation. Direct deaths from overdose, cardiac arrest, and stroke numbered in the hundreds of thousands globally. Indirect deaths from violence, HIV transmission, hepatitis, and other consequences of addiction reached into the millions. Families destroyed by addiction and incarceration affected tens of millions more. Communities devastated by crack epidemic violence, cartel wars, and mass incarceration still hadn't recovered decades later. Economic costs from enforcement, incarceration, lost productivity, and treatment exceeded trillions of dollars. All of this suffering and expense accomplished nothing in terms of reducing cocaine availability or use. The fundamental lesson from cocaine's complete history, from Victorian miracle cure to modern scourge, was society's systematic failure to learn from mistakes or acknowledge when policies had failed catastrophically. Doctors in 1880 prescribed cocaine for every ailment and ignored warning signs of addiction. Prohibition advocates in 1920 assumed criminal penalties would eliminate cocaine use, despite no historical evidence this approach had ever worked with any drug. War on drugs proponents in 1980 escalated enforcement despite decades of failure. Politicians in 2020 maintained prohibition despite overwhelming evidence it caused more harm than it prevented. The pattern repeated with depressing consistency. A new drug emerged. Initial use was unregulated. Problems developed. Society responded with moral panic and criminalization. Enforcement failed but intensified anyway. Decades passed with mounting casualties and no policy changes. Cocaine followed this pattern. Heroin followed it. Methamphetamine followed it. Fentanyl was following it. Each generation confronted drug crises with the same failed prohibition approach, ignored evidence that alternatives worked better, and condemned new cohorts of users to addiction, imprisonment, or death, while enriching criminal organizations that supplied drugs despite enforcement. Cocaine's story wasn't a cautionary tale about drugs. It was a cautionary tale about humanity's stubborn refusal to learn from experience, admit failure, or choose evidence over ideology. The drug that started as medicine and became the foundation for global criminal empires was still here, still profitable, still addictive, still destroying lives. A century of prohibition had changed nothing except which criminals profited and which communities were most devastated. The supply remained constant, the demand remained constant, and the policies remained constant despite mountains of evidence they didn't work. Some lessons apparently will never be learned.